Hello and welcome to The Good, the Bad and the Advertising, the show where we ask, if the world were our client, what would the brief be? In each episode, we look to tackle some of society's biggest challenges with the same creativity and strategic rigour that Adland uses to tackle a client brief. I'm Amy Williams. I'm joined today by my fabulous co-host, Dino Myers-Lamptey, and our special guest this week is the one and only Matt Box. Matt is a hilarious creative strategist, a pretty serious comedian, and a rather sleep-deprived new dad. So I'm excited to see what ideas we come up with today. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. It's incredible.
Thanks for coming.
Such an accurate description, other than kind of good comedian. Tired dad is definitely a new one for me.
Oh man, I bet. Well, congratulations. Hopefully this can take your mind off it for a few precious moments. This week, we're going to talk about getting people with criminal records into employment. It could be quite a divisive topic, especially in a political context where politicians are terrified of being seen to be offender-centric and to put offenders above victims. Victims, of course, are a top priority. The reality is, though, that prisons are populated by very vulnerable people. A quarter of the UK adult prison population also went through the foster care system. According to the Prison Reform Trust, 57% of women in prison report having been victims of domestic violence. By all accounts, this is a vulnerable group. They're people in our society who we would otherwise want to protect. And to be honest, before researching for this episode, I had no idea the extent to which the cards are stacked against them. Employment is obviously pretty frowned upon whilst you're in prison, but you also can't apply for unemployment benefits or universal credit. And once you do leave and finally apply, it takes 6 weeks to process, during which time prisoners receive a pricely discharge grant of £46. It has been £46 since 1995. I have no idea how anyone is supposed to survive for 6 weeks with enough money to buy 3.8 copies of the debut Spice Girls album, Spice. So you're released into poverty and in many cases homelessness, having been failed by so many systems. And the light at the end of this rather depressing tunnel is that according to the Ministry of Justice, former prisoners are 9% less likely to offend if they are in work. Employment is both financially and emotionally empowering, right? It gives you purpose, status, earning power, routine, responsibility, and it gives you a role in society and a sense of personal purpose. Right now, in spite of a national skills shortage, only 17% of ex-offenders are in jobs a year after release, and a third of people claiming job seekers allowance in the UK have a criminal record. So, today we ask, how can we, the advertising industry, influence employers to give a second chance to those who have served their time and want to make a fresh start? Dino, what are you thinking?
Amy, quite frankly, I'm still thinking £46 for 3.8 Spice Girls albums. I mean, that is, if going to prison wasn't bad enough, coming out with that on your mind is even worse than that. Well, I mean, actually, on a serious note, I think it's, in doing a little bit of research behind this, it was quite kind of alarming and quite shocking, really, just how little opportunity and chance, people have. But I think the thing that surprised me probably most was just how many people go into prison, and actually some of the offences are really, they're non-serious offences. So the majority of people that go to prison are non-violent offences.
67%, in fact.
Yeah, and you could call them mistakes, I guess, in sometimes, in terms of mistakes in life, for which the cost of it affects the whole of the rest of your life. In terms of employment is the foundation of life, isn't it? You've got to get money to do things and to improve your life and to, repent in some way or form. And I think that it's no surprise that actually the highest proportion of reoffenders who leave prison are the ones that have only done 12 months. The least amount of time leads to the most amount of reoffence. So there is a bit of a case of, are we putting too many people in prison for the wrong reasons, or for, is there a better form of rehabilitation or correction, let's say? And I think the UK, England and Scotland have disproportionately large amounts of people they send to prison for offences compared to the rest of Europe. So I think that we've got to start to think about prison as an institution for rehabilitation and correction, and actually if it's the right thing in itself anyway. But I think part of this brief is in terms of employment. What occurs to me is the time that's spent in prison is probably good time that could be used to train people up to be better at jobs than a lot of the people that haven't been to prison as such. And I think that's probably what it needs to focus on a little bit more.
Matt, what are you thinking?
So I think the whole kind of thing that kept going through my head thinking about this is that almost just on an economic standpoint, we spend so much money catching criminals, putting them through the system, putting them in prison, and it's expensive to have people in prison. And then when they come out, the phrase repaying a debt to society gets used quite a lot. And one of the best ways to do that is to have a job, to pay your tax, to not reoffend. But at that stage where they should be kind of getting back into employment, we make it kind of as hard as possible. So it feels like there's actually a kind of deeper kind of societal reason, as well as kind of that prison disproportionately affects kind of quite marginalised groups. And, as you were saying, people in foster care systems, a lot of ex-soldiers as well end up in prison. And that's something that kind of people are very passionate about. It's kind of a group and kind of looking after soldiers, but that we kind of make it so hard to repay that debt to society. So that's the kind of main kind of economic problem, which is quite hard to kind of get through. You have to kind of talk about the expense of everything, and then also kind of, but I think you'll always come up against this stigma. This kind of, they've kind of made their own bed. They shouldn't have committed a crime. And I think maybe there is something in kind of helping people realize how easy it is to slip into those kind of situations where you end up making mistakes, and kind of that's a lot easier when you've kind of grown up in maybe a harder situation than other people.
I came across a case as well of a young guy who went to prison. His life changed, so dramatically because he went into prison for a car incident. I think he swerved into the road and head-on collision with another car, and he came out in a coma, in critical condition. But then when he woke up, he was essentially arrested for reckless driving, and then he went to prison. I think he served 10 months of a 4-year sentence, and came out and was completely unemployable. And that was until very recently, when I think Timpsons, he applied to Timpsons, who are a great brand with a track record of employing ex-prisoners and ex-cons. And his life's been turned around quite a lot because, it was announced that, he's been promoted and he's going to be running his own Timpsons. But before that, he was a graduate. And the irony of it was, I think he was working as a prisoner officer trainee or something, I think, which was quite weird and ironic. But it just occurred in reading his case in his article, how quickly it can happen and how quickly a life can be, kind of turned around from hope and promise to complete despair. And the really kind of like striking thing about that was that the crime that he committed, it was a mistake. It was an error. He said that his head wasn't in the right kind of mental space at the time. And there needed to be some kind of, retribution for it, I guess. But ultimately, he was still the same kind of person, had the same kind of like intelligence and qualification, let's say, before, he was a graduate, before he got himself into that mess. And yet he had very little chance. I think he applied to over 100 jobs after that, got rejected from all of them. And what occurs to me is that I think when people come out of prison, it seems like we label them as, kind of ex-cons or prisoners, and don't necessarily ask the question about, okay, well, what was the crime? What was the, what's happened? Who are they now, from who they were before? And I think that's probably a little part of this, is there's almost this kind of re-education as to, people make mistakes. Some mistakes are probably graver than others and carry a harsher punishment. Actually, there's lots of people living in the world who just haven't been caught, have made similar mistakes, but just haven't been caught. The most important thing is just the realization of that it was wrong, and the fact that life's got to move on, but in a better kind of path and direction. And I'm not sure that the system currently really encourages people to ask the right questions. I think we just put them all in the same kind of bucket, and that just sends the fear around everyone else that haven't been to prison. That, oh my God, you're working with someone who's been to prison, and it's like, well, you're probably quite surprised about how many people probably have or should have been to prison had they been caught for doing the things that prison should catch people for, or is designed, the current system's designed to catch people for.
I love that part of your argument here is I'm no worse than other people. I just am the only one that got caught.
I do think there's something in that quite often, and it comes up in discussions about more lenient kind of drug offences, where people say, well, they knew the law, they broke the law, therefore they deserve kind of punishment. And I think the amount of people that speed, it's seen as a very casual law breaking. And kind of if you countered with like, well, do you ever speed? And like, well, of course, I'm not slow or I'm not like an idiot. Of course, occasionally I speed, but I do it safely or whatever kind of reasoning people give themselves, still breaking the law. And there's lots of laws that people do think are acceptable to break. And they probably are linked to kind of how likely you are to go to prison or whether you do a speed awareness course, But I think it's a really good point and a really good, those kind of stories, like the young man you were talking about that got a job at Timpson's, I think are really good at making people reassess the kind of the situation. And it almost feels like there's a political correctness angle on it of kind of ex-con seems like an un-PC piece of language, really, that there's maybe even kind of, we need to create a soft con or some kind of like a word that's kind of like a non-violent kind of previous mistake, that kind of like a way of encapsulating. And maybe it would be the name of that kind of story of the person that you're talking about is kind of highlighting a new name, codifying this kind of employable con.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. We don't have any language that implies forgiveness and a chance to rehabilitate. It's all focused on their past mistake.
Yeah, maybe like, going to prison for a certain term of time is a little bit like going back to school and you leave with grades, potentially. Let's just say. I mean, what if you incentivize, kind of like good behavior, good participation, good kind of like, rehabilitation. So, you come out with your A stars or your Bs, that kind of thing, because, it seems that unless you commit a serious violent crime where you've got, multiple kind of years, if you come out at all, it seems like most crimes, people have an opportunity to shorten the sentence and come out earlier based upon good behavior. But you've got, from the outsider, you've got no real context about, well, what were they really like in prison? Were they the one that was like, had really understood that actually they're going to just work hard, get out and, carry on their life? Or were they the one that was just playing the system and playing the game and whatever and hadn't really learned? And I guess you've got to have a bit of an idea of that, on the way out. And at the moment, I don't think there really is that. We just put them all in the same bucket.
I guess if you were looking to employ anyone, you would check their references and check their track record. But when you're looking into someone with a criminal record, you can't understand that element of it. You can't understand how they bettered themselves, how they learned and improved their skills during their time. You can just see, what class of criminal offence they committed and when they were released. The information available to an employer is actually very little.
I think the fact that they're released, though, should say to you that they have passed the requirements to be let back out and they are safe to work, they are safe for society.
So this actually brings us on to the Timpsons, because I think it is worth just speaking about them a little bit. They are such a good example of a company that employs ex-offenders. And I listened to a few interviews with the founder, the son of the founder. It's a family business. And the main thing that came across to me, listening to him talk about the approach they have, is they don't look at CVs. They literally, all they ask for when you apply for a job at Timpson's is your name and your phone number. And then everyone gets an interview. And in the interview, they have like a Mr. Men process. They have a Mr. Happy, a Mr. Sad, a Mr. Fun, a Mr. Adventurous. And they score you purely on personality. That is the only thing they look at. And they look for 9s or 10s out of 10 on personality based on these Mr. Men characteristics. They don't want people that are lazy. They don't want people that are grumpy. They want people that are energetic, that are going to make their customers feel joyful in the store. Because you can train people how to repair shoes, but you can't change someone's personality. And I just think there's so much to be learned from that trust and that optimism and a genuine second chance that isn't based on any of your previous history. It's based on who you are as a person. I think that's really amazing.
I think that's absolutely fantastic. And I think that I love the Mr. Men approach to things as well, because I think that's what we were talking about in terms of, you need some form of assessment to know that the people that you're hiring are up for it, are up for work, but they're reliable and they've got the right kind of attitude, opposed to kind of like, qualifications, let's say. It's that the fact that they are going forward with life saying, right, I've got to, bring things and get things back on track. And actually, if they have got that kind of attitude, they'll probably work harder and longer for you than the average person who hasn't been through that, same experience. And I like the Mr. Men approach because it kind of like just humanizes it in a fun way, and makes it kind of like more light-hearted rather than looking at them as kind of serious offenders, which I think is the stigma that we're constantly trying to shake. The other example, which is worth mentioning, Timpson's is a UK example that a leading light in the space, but also Grayston Bakery in America, I think, are a good brand to reference as well. So for most people, they'll experience Grayston Bakery through Ben and Jerry's cookie flavored ice cream, the brownie flavor, I think it is. So they provide the brownies that go into the Ben and Jerry's ice cream, as well as lots of other things. But they have a similar approach to, employing ex-cons or prisoners in terms of, no questions asked approach, really.
Right.
If you they operate some kind of almost like an experienced day, I think, where they have rounds where you can turn up and give it a go, and if you stick with it, because I think it's quite a hard shift, then you turn up the next day, you've got the job basically. They announce how many positions they've got and how many people they need, and then they put a certain amount through. But they actively encourage ex-cons to apply, because I love the fact that in their purpose they talk about how they don't employ people to bake cookies and do bakery, but they bake to employ people, which I think is nice.
That is fantastic. I love that.
It's very nice.
Okay, so Matt, you're the creative strategist in the room. How are you thinking about this brief? Where should we focus it?
That's a very good question. It's good in general to kind of summarize some of the points we've made so far. It's just that I guess there's a disconnect between kind of what people realize the situation of being a prisoner is. So I think people don't really realize how much it affects people, how easy it is to end up in that kind of situation, and for your life to be flipped upside down like that, and kind of the different groups that it affects. I guess the main people we need to, I guess there's a wider kind of stigma job to be done of kind of how do we reframe having been to prison. And I quite like some of Dino's suggestions of like you should have some kind of qualification, or some kind of, there should be something on your like CV worthy to come out at the end, which is some kind of like review of your character. And I guess our job to be done really is how do we create more Timpsons? How do we create more companies that put within their, a lot of companies are talking about purpose. A lot of companies talk about how important their people are in employment. How do we get more companies to have that kind of approach, a bit more of an open hiring approach? But then you kind of want them to talk about it as well. I think that's something that people are quite often surprised when they find out that Timpsons are a really good employer of convicts, even though it's quite well known among kind of maybe marketing circles or kind of people that know a bit more about business. But I think general public might not know as much.
It's almost making it something to be proud of. Like there's so much conversation around diversity and inclusion and being a diverse and inclusive employer that is top of the agenda for huge companies, and yet this element of diversity and inclusion isn't something that's typically talked about, and it isn't something that people shout about and are proud of. But it should be, because you're giving people a second chance. It's kind. It's using your platform to create opportunity for others. It's a really amazing thing to be proud of.
Yeah, so I think we kind of, I guess it's employers, people that employ people, the people we're targeting. Mm-hmm. It's almost a B2B kind of play, but then doing it in quite a public way. It's like, actually, there is this wider societal benefit. It just feels like otherwise there's this kind of untouchable class of people that have been to prison that then can't find kind of decent work, and quite often those, they'll end up being parents, and they'll raise kids that they kind of can't help get into the workforce, and there's this kind of big gap of inequality that don't kind of bridge unless you kind of you get better at employing these people. I think that how do we create more Timpsons feels like a good kind of direction for us of getting employers to have kind of more diverse kind of hiring approach, for ex-convicts, but then also communicating that effectively, because then you almost create lots of companies that are then going to spread that message further. Because if they're all kind of changing the way they approach hiring, then they're all telling people about the way that they're changing their approach to hiring, and that kind of spreads that message on and on and on.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that empathy and humanizing is a key part of this. One of the things that kind of like occurs to me is when you watch Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, or Hollywood films and depictions of kind of criminals, you always have this kind of like warm spot for the baddies, when it's done well, and you're a bit like, oh yeah, and every now and then a baddie turns his life around, doesn't he, and becomes a bit of a goodie, that kind of common plot line. And when you look at it like that, you're like, yeah, I'll employ that person if they came along and wanted a job. And in the same way that when you see these documentaries on like Sky and whatever, and it's like, oh Britain's kind of worst criminals or something, they're always talking and interviewing someone who was an ex-con or was part of the gang, and is talking about it in a we used to be really bad sense, but now we're as in times have changed, or they've repented in some kind of way, they've done their time. And at no point are you watching that thinking this person's unemployable. You're thinking this person's gone through it. They've been through it. They've realized that the error of the ways and the way they were living. And I think that's all part of the kind of the humanizing of the criminal as such, and the kind of like framing and renaming of what they kind of are, and allowing them to live another life and to restart. And I think that's an important kind of part of this, in a sense, in terms of humanizing the people that come out in some way or form. It's a bit like, if your neighbor or your someone has been through that, then I think you think about it completely differently. So definitely, if we're involving kind of HR and all the rest of it, I think it's about how do we bring the empathy and humanize it so they get closer to people who've had that experience.
Storytelling. All right, it feels like we've got a really solid brief here. I love the idea of creating more Timpsons, creating more humanity, more empathy for the stories behind these numbers and these quite alienating words. So yeah, it feels like a very B2B brief, focusing on HR departments within companies, how we can champion the people that are giving these individuals a second chance, and how we can create education and awareness to encourage more people to do it. All right, so with that in mind, let's crack on to the response to brief section. We're going to start with if we had no money at all. Just think about how we can be, how we can hustle, how we can be creative, and how we can get something off the ground. I can actually kick off if that's cool.
Okay.
Because I've been thinking about this one a little bit just while we've been talking, and there's a campaign I came across in my research for this episode called Ban the Box. It's an initiative launched by Business in the Community. It was launched in 2013, and today there are 150 employers who are signed up. And essentially, it's about banning the tick box on an application form that says, have you committed a criminal offence, yes or no? It isn't actually a legal requirement to ask about a criminal record for most jobs. There are a few professions where you do need to know, but for most jobs, you don't need to ask, but employers tend to. So Ban the Box is about taking that off the application form and at least not asking until after interview, to give a fair chance to everyone and to unearth skills, abilities and personality before getting embroiled in the history of an individual. So I love that idea. And I also was super inspired by what you were saying earlier, Matt, about reframing the language here and creating something that people can be proud of. So I was thinking, what if we took those 150 employers who have already signed up to Ban the Box, and they're big employers, right? It's like Accenture, Boots, Co-op, Lloyds Bank, Carpetright. Like there's some some big names, and we take all of them and we reframe the language and we call them second chance employers, and we give them that stamp, that badge that says they are second chance employers. They have signed up to Ban the Box. They've taken these steps and they are proud of that movement. I've recently moved to Surrey, so I'm now a commuter wanker. And so I've been looking at all the ads on commuter trains, and they're empty. There's so many ads on commuter trains about ads on commuter trains because the space is empty. So take all that empty space, give it for free to the companies that sign up to Ban the Box, and offer them a campaign that champions their brand, champions their business, and says that they are proud to be a second chance employer.
Amazing. I love it.
Very
I
good.
love the reframing of second chance employers. I think that's really good. I love tapping into an existing network of ban the box companies. And I love the reuse of kind of dead commuter space, which I think is probably partly pandemic related as well. But I can definitely see there's so much space for, if you think of the buildings of those kind of employers, if you're looking at kind of co-ops, if you're looking at, they all have kind of community boards that have kind of local good news stories, money given to football teams, all of the kind of the space within these stores that kind of a lot of people will end up seeing.
Very good. I guess that's a great kind of idea, and I'll build on it a little bit in terms of with the second chance in employers, because you need a bunch of companies that are already sold in to the benefits to really kind of like lead by example. So I think using them, what I think is potentially missing here is we need to get the HR and the people in employment slightly closer and to humanize this kind of empathy point, the whole kind of prison population and the prisoner. One way that I'm stealing a bit of an idea from Speakers for Schools, which is a program that encourages, people in work and businesses to go into schools and speak to students. I think we should have speakers for prisons. So, we should be encouraging people to go and talk to prisoners about careers, about getting into employment, about things that are potentially available to them. Yeah, and I think one of the things that Speakers for Schools does really well is it makes it almost competitive from a business sense, in terms of it attracts how many hours employees are dedicating towards talking in local schools, and it makes it really kind of like mathematical and easy, but it almost kind of like league table ifies it, so people can see their contribution and what it's really kind of like, giving back in that sense. So I think that if you get these companies, these the ones that are willing, the second chance companies, to sign up to it and to lead by example and start to encourage their staff to spend time in local prisons. Everyone should do at least one, shouldn't you?
Yeah.
At least once in your life, you should probably go into a prison and do it. If you can, if you've got the opportunity, go and talk about something inspirational to them, which hopefully will be about the world of work and what you do, and how potentially there are opportunities for people that come outside looking to do something similar. And I think that just makes it probably a little bit real. If you get in that environment, you talk to them, you probably take away that kind of fear and that kind of stigma that you've also kind of got, the baggage that's already there. So I think that would be my idea for free.
Yeah, I love that. That's so good. I would feel so much more comfortable and confident having a relationship with ex-offenders if I had had personal experience of it. It feels like this very distant thing to me, and I would be nervous about saying the wrong thing, or not understanding their perspective, and I would just be so nervous and so shy about getting involved. It is a huge barrier. So just having that experience, like you say, everyone should go in once. I love that. I would sign up.
Yeah, I really like that. I used to work with a really lovely ethnographer called Paul Eden, but he ran a book club in a prison, and Penguin provided all the books for free, which is a really nice thing that they do that they probably don't talk about. And he told me an anecdote of kind of reading The Big Short while in prison with these kind of prisoners, and then kind of half the group being kind of, oh, it's all the bankers' fault why we're all in this situation. And a couple of the kind of members of the book group being like, well, that was us, that's why we're in prison, which is quite amazing. But also on the personal story, I've got an uncle that's just got out of prison during a lockdown, which is fun for him. He's kind of a drunk driver, caused an accident, ended up in prison. And so he's really struggled to kind of get work since. And I think it is when you see people as a homogenized group, it's really easy to kind of discount them or kind of not really think of them as individual people. But when it's kind of part of your family or someone that then you kind of go that they're not really a bad person. And I think that is the kind of making a homogenized group into kind of an individual, I think, can be quite helpful.
So we're all just going to come round and have dinner with your uncle?
Yeah, meet Paul.
Come and meet Paul.
Yeah. Have I got to come up with a good free idea now?
If you got one, hit us.
I mean, it all depends on kind of what you consider free, I guess. But I just think, and this probably isn't free in any way, you almost want kind of someone who does have a kind of convict story to kind of come out and talk about it a bit more. And someone that's potentially in the public eye, or kind of a musician, or someone that kind of outside of these kind of like, I was drunk driving from an awards do, you want kind of that a bit more kind of grassroots, which I imagine would come from kind of a music background maybe, or something a bit more kind of where someone hasn't had kind of a movie star background maybe. But you want them to talk about it kind of publicly, go on kind of This Morning and kind of be a bit more public. And I appreciate that's probably not really counted as free, but I feel like those are the kind of the little stories that people tell between themselves, even though it probably does involve quite a decent kind of PR team and people kind of hassling the This Morning editorial staff. Then outside of that is, I think, just kind of maybe signage or like a badge. If we were creating this second chance employer, what is that kind of badge that they can stick on their job adverts, their kind of their windows, their kind of, how can we kind of create a bit of a brand around these second chance employers, and create kind of a literal stamp of approval.
Yeah, I like that, like a fair trade stamp. Yeah, that's nice.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess it's helping encourage that network. So getting like Timpsons to then tell other employers kind of this is the Mr. Men system and kind of this is how you implement it, because those are the kind of quite practical kind of boring parts of it. My boss actually, Johnny McCallum, he was telling me about Timpsons, which is why I know that they kind of hire ex-cons, because his dad used to play golf with the founder, I think, or kind of one of the family. And then he was telling me that, so this is like a friend of a friend of a friend story, really. So you never really know how kind of true it is. But that they found out that a few of their kind of staff were kind of taking money from the till. And so rather than kind of reprimand everyone or kind of hunt them down and kind of make it a bit of a witch hunt, they just released information on like, these are all the different ways that you'd scam the company if you wanted. Almost like a how-to guide. But that completely stopped everything, because they kind of, people realized that whatever it was you were doing, they knew what you were doing and they were onto you. And I think that's just a really interesting way of kind of approaching your employees, especially if you kind of know they might have a certain background, but it's kind of treating them with a bit more respect than kind of, this is a witch hunt, or kind of, we know you've taken a bit too long on a fag break. And I think those are the kind of educational jobs that kind of someone who already has experience employing ex-cons kind of give to other people.
That's a wonderful story. That's so true. It comes back to what I was saying about it's built on trust, that whole system. And it's easy to say it. It's much harder to do it. It's easy to say that you'll trust ex-cons when you hire them, but then you put in place rigorous checks and balances that disempower them. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
All right, so now we move on to the unlimited money idea. This is where you can just really, the sky is the limit. Just go crazy. Spend all of Jeff Bezos's money.
I think that, if money didn't matter, then for me, we need to probably put more skills and programs in prisons themselves. So, you can actually get real confidence in the fact that you can almost pre-select the people to come and work for you and employ the people. So, right now, I think, if you get a job in prison, it tends to be some kind of like mundane kind of like, dismantling this, building up this kind of job, repairing roads or something. But actually, what if we can get a program that we encourage some of these second chance employers to actually create actual kind of like training programs for prisoners, so they can actually learn the real skills that they're going to need to work in those companies after employment. So, I don't know whether Timpsons does this, but actually, rather than just employ them once they come out, actually, is there a way of actually setting up some of the function of what they do to actually happen while they're actually in prison? So you can skill people up when they're in those places, so they know what work looks like. They know what, not just kind of mundane kind of factory work looks like. They actually can see the possibilities of using slightly more skilled kind of jobs and using their brain a little bit more, rather than just kind of brute kind of like, physical labor type stuff. So I think that would be it. I think that I would, encourage and set up a program for these second chance employers plus more to actually, create training programs for prisoners.
And I can really see that those brands as well as companies adding an extra level of kind of employability. So like to say that I've got a Timpsons diploma in kind of shoe repair post kind of coming out of prison, I think it just completely reframes that kind of, what's this 2-year gap in your CV?
Yeah.
That's a really nice reframing. And there's a company that does this. It's a social enterprise. But there's a few actually, but one that stood out to me was Code 4000. It was founded by a guy called Michael Taylor. And the idea is to reduce reoffending rates by teaching prisoners how to code and preparing them for employment into the tech sector. To your point, Dino, more cerebral training and work rather than purely manual labor. They started in 2017. They're not huge yet, but none of their graduates have reoffended. 85% remain engaged in either employment, education, or training so far. So it's early days, but that's a really lovely example of that more complex training that actually creates a huge amount of opportunity, frames it as a college.
Nice.
Got quite a wild card suggestion. And,
oh, God.
But I thought, if anywhere, talk about it here. My father-in-law he stepped down recently, but was a magistrate. Him and his kind of magistrate friends would kind of talk about, quite often they see the same faces over and over again. So it's people that are reoffending, committing the same crimes. And he says there's kind of like a turning off point. Like sometimes someone ends up kind of reoffending for like their whole life, and you just keep seeing the same face over and over again. And some people, you kind of just stop seeing them. And he said like the most common kind of reason that you kind of stop seeing them is that they find love. They get a good woman, or they have a wife and they kind of settle down and they have kids, and that's the thing that turns their life around. And I know that young kind of Premier League footballers actually encourage them to get married quite young and have kids quite early, because it stops the partying lifestyle and it stops them kind of getting into trouble, because a young man with kind of lots of money can be quite a dangerous thing so young. And so I do think that maybe the Bezos kind of idea is some kind of ex-con dating service, in that kind of get some of these guys hooked up. And there is a kind of weird thing in kind of women writing to prisoners, I think, but also just like that, I think that could be quite an effective way of kind of turning people's lives around.
I mean, we didn't even talk about the fact that prison is a disproportionately, it's a man's problem largely. It's what is it, 98% or something or whatever else, a male in prisons. So that's the kind of a major point of this whole kind of answer in this brief. Actually, women tend not to go to prison. It's almost by mistake they end up in there, I guess. Just the rarity, in terms of the population split. So it is a male problem, and that whole idea of bored, lonely males trying to make it up the ladder, I guess, probably leads to kind of crime. So I really like that. Maybe there's kind of like a naked attraction version of the prison population. The prison attraction on Channel 4.
Married at first sentencing.
Well, I do really like this this TV approach as well, because I was thinking kind of Gogglebox. I was like, what's the way that you can really humanize?
Yeah. Oh my God,
they are
Matt,
just like us.
This is literally my idea. Yeah, I love it. Okay, so that was like what I was thinking was like, how can we steal from reality TV? Because reality TV do such a good job of humanizing groups of the population. Like, Channel 4 Benefit Street like vibes can be quite exploitative, but when it's done right and sensitively, it does give you this insight into a community that you otherwise wouldn't see, and creates this very mainstream awareness of someone else's perspective. So I was thinking for like the £1 million idea that we should parody reality TV shows. Like we could partner with Channel 4, say, and create a parody series of reality TV shows following prison leavers. You could have an actual show following prison leavers. I actually think that would be really interesting, looking at how they rebuild and reintegrate into society. But also if you spoof other reality TV shows and create a campaign that's about like understand their reality, whether it's like Married at First Sentencing or like, I don't know, Jersey Shawshank, come do time with me. Like you could have a kind of a quite silly campaign that takes like all these very, very iconic reality TV shows and does like a spin on it for the life of an offender and an ex-offender. And the strapline and the sort of call to action is like understand their reality.
Like it.
Nice.
It reminds me of, I don't know if you remember, but while we were at Ogilvy, Amy, Rory Sutherland went to a Qatari prison for like 24 hours to refute because he was vaping on a plane, and they.
Oh my God!
And so, like when he came out of it, I remember hearing him talk about it, and some of the press around it was that kind of I would, after being in kind of a cell for 24 hours, he would donate to any charity that kind of worked with prisoners because he had that kind of personal experience of it. And it makes me think of, Undercover Boss, when like the boss kind of has to go to the bottom rung of the kind of the business and kind of suddenly realizes that maybe things aren't quite as rosy as they thought it was. And maybe that's kind of what we need. We kind of need big businesses to try and get employed with kind of like a fake criminal record, meet some prisoners on the way and kind of realize just how difficult it is to get a job and to kind of be on that bottom rung of the ladder as kind of a convict. And that's the kind of the way you'll get that real understanding change, is to kind of go to the big bosses and kind of go, imagine if you hadn't had kind of this easy path to your kind of, I'm sure you work quite hard, but to building your business, like what if you had an even harder start?
I love the idea of like a life swap program, which is a bit like the sad, unfortunate story of your uncle, drink driving. I mean, there's probably lots of people who, have lived very similar lives, but then they make one wrong decision like that. Or maybe he did it a number of times, but he got caught or made a mistake or whatever it was. But at some point, the fork in the road happens and it goes one way rather than the other way. And there's probably very similar people who have just been fortunate enough not to, make that mistake. And almost like if you get people whose lives have almost been identical up until that point and get them to life swap in that instance to basically see how different it could be, that's quite revealing, I think, making it as close to their reality as possible.
I love really bad puns. And so the first kind of bad pun that I kind of wrote was some kind of, turning cons into pros.
We're writing ads now.
But,
oh man, that is the strapline of Dino's idea, surely.
Yeah.
Turning cons into pros.
So there is something you can see as kind of a nice life swap. I really like that idea.
Me too.
I think people think that prison is like a holiday camp or something. There's that kind of perception as well. So I think kind of changing that, everyone after a year of being kind of locked indoors, I think realizes that actually the mental effects, even if you can watch telly all the time and kind of have access to, your own kind of garden, it's still quite enough to drive you kind of stir crazy. I always think of just the irony of like my uncle spending so long in prison to get out and then everything be locked down, and like how annoying that must be, kind of thinking about freedom and then suddenly you can't go in shops and you have to wear a mask and all these other kind of things that feel like slight restrictions.
Yeah, that's actually a great way to build empathy. This shared experience is very uniting. Oh man, that feels like a whole new brief. We're gonna have to cancel all our meetings, guys. We've got a lot more to do. No, I mean, honestly, we're never going to have all the answers. This is such a huge and complex issue. But I hope that over the last 40 minutes or so, we've raised a few more questions and inspired some new ideas. If you listening are enjoying chewing over this issue with us, then there are some really amazing initiatives that you can check out in this space. As I mentioned, Code 4000, the Second Chance Studios based in New York, that trains ex-cons in podcasting. At Bad Boys Bakery, based in Brixton Prison, that supply baked goods to Cafe Nero's near you. Like a ton of amazing initiatives. So yeah, let's give them a little bit of space and champion them. And if you want to, you can get involved. In fact, if you're a startup or you work in the startup world and you think you might be able to contribute to this challenge, the Ministry of Justice actually have a Prison Leavers Innovation Challenge live right now. So they're offering SMEs up to £350,000 in grant funding if they can help with this exact topic. So yeah, there's a couple of things to check out. If you want to get in touch with us and share your own ideas or challenge some of the suggestions that we've put forward, then the LinkedIn profiles of myself, Dino and Matt will be in the show notes. So connect with us and yes, stay in touch. All that's left to do is thank Matt Box for joining us and to thank you, our listeners, for listening.
Yes.
See you next time.